we often talk about having eyes to see where God is at work around us. In some cases, what he's already doing. But how does that look in your own life? So maybe that's some of the rhythms or practices that you have that helps you keep your eyes open to this. And especially as we apply that to sort of those big four places that we always talk about, where you live, work, go to school, and play. Yeah, how do we see where God is at work around us and what he's already doing?
I like the way you break it down, where we live, work, go to school, and play. I think in every single aspect, and I can't stress this enough, despite myself, despite what I have not done, despite, God is at work and doing his thing, and then after the fact, opening up my eyes so I can see what he has done. Whether it be situations of health, whether it be employment, whether it be the kids, whether it be just relationships. He's leading the charge, and it's only after the fact when I see the stumbles that I've made, the mistakes that I've made, when I see the pitfalls or the things that I've missed, then I realize that he has been there all along and he has been carrying me through. And I think. So I think, in a sense, I live my life in almost like a retrospective, because I'm always looking back and seeing what he's doing after the fact. There are times when I think I can see where he's leading me to, but I often try not to focus too much on that and just focus on following him, focus on trying to stay connected to him and just trust his leading. Because I have all the experience of how he has rescued and saved and just preserved me for, in every sphere of my life. So, to me, it just feels like looking back in the mirror and seeing what God has done. And I think there's a bit of encouragement in that as well, because oftentimes when we're going through certain things, we're in certain places of our lives, we don't feel like we're getting done the things that we want to get done. We don't think we're accomplishing those things. We don't think our life has meaning. We don't think our children are doing the right thing. We don't think we're where we need to be. And it's only through recognizing God's grace and seeing his hand in retrospect that we realize that, wait a minute, God was there all along. When I thought I was all alone, when I thought I'd come to the end of my rope, God was always there, guiding, leading, and directing. And so I think living a life of gratefulness and thankfulness, I think is really key, because I think when we do pause, and I think the pause is really important. I don't think we pause enough to reflect on what the day was like, the week was like. I think when we take that pause to reflect and to really give thanks, I think our eyes get open to all that God has done and likely will continue to do for us, right? So I think the pause is really important.
Early in our marriage, Todd read a book, and I always get this mixed up, but Frank Laubach, I think, is the guy, and I think the book is Practicing the Presence of God, and he tells about Brother Lawrence. I think I've got that right. Brother Lawrence was a monk who literally tried to live his life where he did everything aware of the fact that God was with him, including washing the dishes, like pulling weeds, everything. Like he tried to practice it as though like he was literally, you could see him right there. And that had a real impact on me when Todd shared that with me. And so I'm no Brother Lawrence, but what I try to be mindful of as much as possible at work, in hard times, in good times, when I'm driving in the car, like all different kinds of times, is to kind of be mindful that he's there doing stuff. And I think isn't it Kathy Ribble who calls them God sightings? To just try to look for that, and have started to also ask him to give me eyes to see, because there's so much that otherwise goes like right over my head, right? So I'm realizing that I actually, if I'm gonna see him, I need his eyes or his help to see him, because that's a spiritual thing.
For myself personally, it's always been conversations like this, where you get to a table and there's no real expectation or that kind of thing. You don't know what's going to be said. And then you you learn lots, you share, exchange of minds and that kind of thing, and in many ways you get humbled, I think. And so that's always just really good for the soul, because you are able to walk away thinking, I didn't think of that before, or that's a really good check on me. Thank you, God, for kind of reminding you of where priorities need to be, and just, again, growing and flourishing, right? So.
And as we think about sharing the fruit of flourishing, how do we make sure we are communicating with one another to share these stories and to do exactly what you've just described, Chelsea? Like what are some ways or some practices, some things that we need to do more of in order to share those stories and make sure we're sharing and hearing and seeing and raising our awareness levels?
I think praise is important. I think, and we were joking earlier about testimonies. But I think praise, just giving God thanks, is really important, because I think sometimes it gives other people it gives them permission to just think and to reflect on just, wait a minute, you're saying God did this, and did he? What has he done for me? And sometimes we have to think. Sometimes we ask ourselves that question, and God isn't offended by it, because he knows what the answer will be once we think about it. I think praise is important. I think thinking about what just all that your life has been and could have been, and really spending the time to engage in a little bit of thanksgiving and reflection, I think is really, really important. I think if we encourage each other in that, the times of reflection, what would you be, there's a question, what are you thankful for? Sometimes the kids would come home, and apparently it's something they do at the end of the day, and when they were younger, what was great about your day, or the rose, or whatever they call it now. But it's really good, because it forces you to think through your day and to think of what was really, really awesome about my day. And for us as adults or not adults, to think, okay, where did God show up for me today, or yesterday, or the last week? And then to really think through about where would I love for him to show up again for me in the coming week and the coming day and the coming year. And so I think just that, taking the time to reflect, to offer up thanksgiving, and to praise with abandon, and because I think that's kind of freeing, for me anyway. I find it's freeing, and it really brings us to a place of authenticity, but also humility. When you see that much of what you've done was not you, was just him. You were just along for the ride. I think that does bring some humility as well, for sure. So.
And then when you do that and you realize all of that stuff, is it bad form to answer the question by saying what you said in the question, that then we actually legitimately just have to share those stories, right? How do you share them? Well, you actually pick to share them, right? You actually pick to celebrate. I want to tell you an exciting God thing that happened to me. I want to tell you, can I tell you a story about what happened to me this week that God did? And give him the praise, give him the credit for it, but also spread the word, because it is faith building, right? When you hear present day stories that God is the same God as he was back in the Bible doing all those super cool miraculous things, it builds our faith, right? And that helps us buy in and want to figure out, how can I go deeper with him, because it's really amazing when you hear those kinds of stories, right?
I think when I think about that is as a church body, I think especially if part of your interaction with this church is a Sunday morning, there's not a lot of intimate space there, right? There's not a lot of space for these conversations that, Chelsea, you were saying you find so valuable. So I think part of what we can do as a church too is find intimate space where we can share these stories either with each other or with other people outside of our congregation. That could be a meal, that could be coffee, that could be sitting down with someone, going for a walk. And I think sometimes if we see this church as sort of something we attend versus something that we're deliberately a part of on a day-to-day basis, I think those stories can be shared more. We can talk more about what's hard. We can talk about what we're celebrating. But we need to find those moments where those things are conducive and where you feel comfortable to share it. Because not everyone's going to feel comfortable to waltz up onto the stage and say, this is what happened to me this week. But lots of people are so happy to share a story over dinner or share a story over a walk or something like that. And so I think finding intimate spaces is also really important for us, which is hard in a big building.
That's true. And I love that, because the next question is about what does genuine celebration look like in a faith community or in other communities that maybe you've experienced or are a part of? And so I wonder if there's, I love what you said about finding an intimate space to do that. Are there other things? Like, how else can we genuinely celebrate with one another within our community?
I think echoing what you said earlier is the knowing of the people. When you know the people, the big and the small are celebrations of when they achieve something, regardless of the size. But you have to know the people. And I think that if we kind of bring it full circle in ways, and going back to what we talked about earlier in the beginning with, you know, listening and comprehending and then stepping into faith and going forward, right? Some of us flourish simply by just stepping forward into the church and sitting beside someone you don't know. And again, having that simple conversation, handshake, whatever it is, to start the knowing.
Yeah, I feel like telling stories is a way to celebrate. Like, if you think about how, like, there are generations and whole cultures that are, they retell their culture's story again and again at various celebrations, and that's actually an integral part of the celebration. And when you were talking about the family analogy and what happens, you know, what was the good part of your day, like, that's part of healthy family, right? Is like, you share what's happening, you talk about the good and the bad, and you celebrate, you have birthday parties, you have like all those kinds of things. So creating those opportunities for those kinds of celebrations so that you can tell the stories in big and small ways. But yeah, I'm really stuck on the telling stories thing. I think that's a huge piece of how we know each other even, right?
For sure. Oftentimes, I think when you're at a church or, you know, you're a part of something, you don't actually have a great perspective on sort of like seeing what that's done in your life, right? And so, like, for me, like, I remember when I was a teenager, I used to find church quite difficult, you know? Like, I found it really hard. I didn't really love being here. And so, but then as I look back on my life, I met my wife at this church. My best friend in my whole wide world I met at this church. So I think sometimes you can sort of noticing what's happened here, noticing people at the church that have done something big for you. It doesn't take much on a Sunday to walk up and be like, I was thinking about you the other day and you've been really good to me. Like, you've been a big presence in my life. There was a time that was hard and you were there. And those kind of bonds build like real connections, and it really doesn't take much to say to someone, that meant a lot. You might have not noticed that it meant a lot, but it did mean a lot. And so I think sometimes even in our own congregation, noticing someone, noticing something small they did, noticing, I loved when Jim this past week got up on the stage and he said to all the people, thanks for the people who did the worship this morning. Thank you for the people that did the tech. Thank you for that. And so, like, we need to do more of that. We need to notice when someone's doing something that's lifting us all up. We need to notice and say, I notice you, I appreciate it. And I love being in community with you. And that stuff is so sort of enriching for all of us. And so I think part of it, like Chelsea's saying, is knowing, but also noticing, right? Like, that person shows up all the time and they do this and they do that. And so I sometimes, for me, I should be more grateful for this place than, you know, I realize that I have been in my life. And so how much fruit has come out of this place for me? I should be able to say to people that are here that, you know, that means a lot. So I think that's another piece of it too, right?
There's a piece, an element that we do that perhaps because it comes so easy to us, we don't really recognize it. But it's creating that space. You know, you talked about intimate space earlier, which I think is just so much in there. But creating that space for us to have conversation, even if it's after the service. Sometimes it can seem transient, and I'm terrible at, you know, these kind of quick one-off conversations. But just having the opportunity to mingle, to interact, and to talk, to bounce into each other and say, hey, how are you doing? And to really spend a few minutes or longer trying to delve a little deeper and getting to know the person. Because I think unless we create those opportunities, unless we cultivate those opportunities and nurture them, because oftentimes when we're looking to curtail stuff or to get out of the building, those are the first things that we get rid of. But I think it's really important, because that's great ways for us to just connect, to touch point, to confirm some stuff, to make plans to do other things together. And I think it's a way we get to know people, because it's really hard to meet people when we're spread out amongst, so many pews. But having that time right after the fact and making sure that folks know that this is a time for us to get together and to talk to each other and to get to know one another better. And if there's any way we can make it more robust or more meaningful, I think we do well if we're able to do that. But I think it's something that we have now. And again, it comes so easily to us. It doesn't seem like anything, but I think it's an element of strength, I think, as well.
To just sort of tie the whole thing back to the whole plant theme we've had going on. We have this back corner of our backyard where there's a garden that it was really hard for there to be anything growing in properly, and that part's not my fault. That's just the way the back of the garden is. Anyways, a friend of mine was doing gardening at her house, and she had extra ground cover, and because she had too much, so she sent out a message saying, "Does anyone want some ground cover?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'll take it," because I wondered if Todd and I wondered if maybe we put ground cover back there, if that would solve the problem. And so we planted these 5 little piddly things that she gave us, and that entire garden is completely covered with this gorgeous ground cover that takes zero attention. There's little purple flowers, there's tons of green leaves, it's gorgeous. And it happened because she shared. And then her sharing with us allowed for this beautiful growth. So it feels like this idea of flourishing is inextricably connected to this idea of community and sharing. And yeah, it was 5 individual little seedlings or whatever you call them. We'd need your parents to help us understand. But once they were planted and offered the opportunity, they just took over our back garden, despite my ineptness.
Well, I just want to say thanks again to each of you for being willing to open your hearts and your minds and your mouths and to chat together and share so openly like you did. I know that I'm speaking for everyone on the other side of the screen too when I say that. It's just such a rich experience to do this and to listen and to chat together in community. So thank you to each of you.
That's how these videos start.
That's how it goes.
So even more room.
You brought notes today.
More space. I have notes today.
Jim has notes. This is significant.
Okay, let's not set the bar so high. Okay, there are things that I was like, I want to articulate these things. I just don't want to mess up in that way. So.
Great. I can't wait. I've loved hearing from a couple of people this week who have said they've been watching these conversations and it's like they sort of stick with them throughout the week in a little bit of a different way than other forms of communication. And they've kind of mulled over, that thing that person said. And it's brought, some processing and new perspective. And a couple of people have come to me specifically and shared that. And I've loved hearing that. And I find that for myself too. It's been really, really cool.
I think that's significant too because we're such busy people, and sometimes I wonder, do people actually have space for this?
Sure.
And it's not like space magically appears, you have to make that space.
Sure.
So I love the fact that some of this is trickling in, and I often wonder if that's also how one of the elements in which God gets our attention, right?
Yeah.
It's not always the burning bush, it's like, here's something.
The things that play over.
Yeah, and I think it's important. I think
that's neat.
I think it's relearning in a culture that's kind of gone a certain sort of rhythm and space and time. So I think it's important. Right?
Yeah, me too. Well, this was a goodie.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I have notes.
You go, please, without further ado.
Well, there's a couple of things, and I hopefully can tie together. One of the things I really loved was that the thread of what was spoken about had this tone of looking back.
Yeah.
And I just remember this one anecdote that was shared with us by one of my professors who came and spoke to us during an event that we had here. And he talked about how the Indigenous community moves into the future,
Right.
unlike North Americans do. And what he gave was, he said, in the West, in modern day civilization, we tend to move into the future face first. So we're pulled by the future. And he said the indigenous community is propelled into the future by looking to the past. And by doing so, there's like an honoring of the story, honoring of the tradition. And what I think I heard in this video with this conversation was a little bit of that, in that our community strives to not just charge ahead into the future and say, oh yeah, this is where God is inviting us. He is. But almost that we recognize how God is moving us by looking back at what he's done.
Totally.
And it's almost like he plants a trajectory to the future by that. And so, I don't know, I'm still wrestling. I love that image from our Indigenous brothers and sisters, that
I love that.
we are propelled into the future with our backs to the future, because we honor what God has done in the past. And it doesn't mean that we're not forward looking, but it just means that we are moved by a different force.
Right. That's good.
I thought that was really interesting, and I think everybody shared bits of that. Like,
Right.
looking back is important. We have to pay attention. And I think the other thing that, if I could share this, that I heard several of them, I think Elizabeth was even saying this about, you share this by sharing it, you know? And I think, speaking of our culture, I think in some ways, and I'm guilty of this, Christianity and our faith has somewhat become private. So if something happens, it's like, yay, God's done this.
Yeah.
And I think the kind of community that God is making is meant to be shared. And so how do we get into this rhythm of publicly bringing what God has actually done, like normalizing it? Like, what has God done in your life? Not in sort of like a come to my church type of way, but it's like no, this is how God interacts with me on a regular basis. So even what you said at the start, where people are wrestling with it, I love that. Share that.
Me too.
You know,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, that's good. And I think your 2 points are my 2 points, which is in a different way.
Yeah.
But to the point about sort of looking back, I think it was Previn who talked about looking at his life in retrospect, or living a little bit retrospectively. And I just thought I really loved that. I really liked the emphasis on pause and reflection.
Yes.
And I just think that is breeding ground for gratitude. And how we're able to look back and to see all of those moments where God was, that maybe we didn't notice in the busyness or the fullness, or, you know, it's just hard to have that perspective sometimes when you're right in the middle of it. But to be able to look back, I think that it just causes so much gratitude to grow. And I also think that this is a really great practice that helps us to begin to raise our own awareness of finding God in the moment too.
Yeah.
So it's almost like we start to recognize where he is and how to find him there, and where we're gonna see him or hear his voice. And then we begin to sort of practice that in the moment too, and to look for him everywhere in every moment, as Elizabeth was sharing about Brother
Lawrence.
Brother Lawrence,
Sure.
yeah,
To many, he was a
absolutely, yes. And then your other point about sharing and sharing our stories and doing that in community, and how important that was. I love this quote. One of my favorite authors says she wants to live with an extremely low bar for delight. And I thought, I wonder what that would look like if we in our community had an extremely low bar for celebration. Yeah. You know, we sometimes think we have to have these massive life change moments or something just really big in order to share it and to celebrate it, or to celebrate what God's doing. But I think you're so right that the more we share, even in little ways, like what if we just lowered that bar for celebration? What if everything deserved some kind of a celebration, and at least an acknowledgement?
I think that the passage or the instance that comes to my mind is when Jesus heals the lepers. That's a big deal, like when your leprosy is healed. and then just one comes back and says thank you. And I think one could make an argument that sort of the consumer culture that we live in is very much use and abuse. Like, hey, I've gotten it, I've used it, done, move on with it, right? So, and I've achieved it because I paid something to do it. And I love what you just said about the reflection to pause and think, because it sort of says to people, actually, this thing that came about in my life came because there's someone greater, God, who is engaged in my life, wants to interact, but more than just give us something that we can consume, wants to relate to us.
Sure. Yeah.
And again, like it just pops open this idea of like, okay, so what does God want to build in you and to others from that? So I think your idea of the low bar of celebration, is that right? Did I say it right? Is actually a jumping off point to growing together in what God is doing. And I think that's
good.
That's really good. Yeah.
That's good.
So it's great.
Cool. So the question or the piece of reflection that we want to leave people with. So as you look back on yesterday, where did you see God? So try to be specific if you can when you think of this. And then how does that affect your perspective as you look towards tomorrow? And then the second, or maybe even third part of that is, who can you share this with?
Lots more to come.